Hi everyone! So we are back with another Recreate in Excel video, and this time around we built a repository of local plants of medicinal importance. This repository is set up such that you can click on any of the plants from the list of plants in the database and then see the plant family name, common names, local names, and medicinal uses. And then over to the right you see a visual of the plants, parts of the plants that are used for medicinal purposes. This is the source database. It has 6 columns: species name, family name, local name, common name, parts used, and medicinal use for each of the species. And I believe there are about 800 or so species on this database. And I have done some initial cleanup work on the family column. You can see the conditional formatting in operation to highlight the duplicates and just look through the data to correct any spelling errors or any transpose errors that I have come across. So I've done an initial cleanup of this database. Over to the wireframe, I have moved to another sheet and I'm just doing a rough sketch of what the repository is going to look like. Unlike my other Recreate videos where I have a template and I'm working with it, I'm building this template from scratch, so I have to visualize it to understand what I'm doing. And every now and then I go to the back end just to establish some certain facts, and then I flip over, so you notice me flipping back and forth. But the main build, the wireframe, in the wireframe I establish the space for the scientific name, the space for the navigational element on this dashboard, which will be the topmost layer, the space for the scientific name, the space for the common name, the medicinal uses, the local names, and that section colored in yellow where I want to have the parts of plant information visualized using a sample plant diagram. So I have established the different parts that are going to fit into this repository, the visual layer of the repository, and I've color coded them, and I'm just creating a legend at the edge just to double check that I have represented all the columns in the original database in this wireframe. Now the wireframe is set up. It's a really rough sketch, but it does the job. It captures the different elements and it gives me a guide on how I'm going to build this dashboard. And now over to the visual layer proper, and as I normally do, I'm using cell formatting, colors, cell fill colors, borders to create placeholders to establish where the different sections of the dashboard are going to be and how they're going to be aligned to one another. I'm basically just using borders to delineate the area for the scientific name, the area in gray in our wireframe. I've done the area for the diagram, the area in yellow, and then I'm going over to do the common name, family name areas, all using borders. And then these borders, I might remove them after I'm done, but just at this point in time I'm really just ideating and I'm just using them right now just to give myself a guide of what things will look like. I'm setting up the medicinal uses section, and we established that the highest number of medicinal uses for any single plant is 16. So what I'm doing is setting up a table of 2 columns and 8 rows so that this visual layer is going to be able to accommodate all lengths and all sizes of information available on the original database. I make some slight adjustments just to create borders for the tables I've set up. Now to the navigational buttons. I select the buttons using from the developer tab, their form controls, command button form controls, and then I just shape them into square-like shapes. And what I'm going to do is just to edit the text in them. So these navigational buttons are supposed to mimic the UI elements that represent move to the first item, move the item back by 1 step, back by 1 step, move forward by 1 step, and move to the last item. So there are going to be 4 navigational buttons. The first one having 2 less than signs, the second one having 1 less than sign, the third one having 1 greater than sign, and then the fourth one having 2 greater than signs. This is basically the universally recognized design for this kind of navigational buttons, and I'm just stepping into the form control, right clicking, selecting edit text to change the text to match this design. And then as I'm working, I'm grouping the elements because they're small elements and I want to be able to control their alignments, their distribution. I really want them to look as neat and as standard as possible. So I'm controlling that by grouping them so that every time they move, I move them, they maintain their alignment to one another, they're aligned up, they're distributed the right way. And then what I'm doing is in between the two groups of buttons, there is going to be a counter showing number one, basically identifying what position the item that has been selected is. So when I move to the first item, it's going to show 1 of 832, which is the total number of names in the database. When I move to the second one, it's going to show 2 of 832 and on and on and on. So that number one, that text box where the number one is going to be linked to a dynamic cell that changes based on the index of the name that has been selected. And I have selected all the elements, including the text elements, grouped them together and moved them to the right of the database. I'm now moving the elements around. Ideally, I should have done that in the first place to create space for the list box that is going to contain the list of all the plants, the scientific names of all the plants. This list box is also a form control that can be accessed from the developer tab, developer insert form control. I've put it in the database, and I play around with the idea of having a combo box, a drop down that would also contain the list of the scientific names of the plants, but I later remove it because I feel it's too much. I think we already have enough navigational elements on the repository, and then I've put in the heading of the dashboard, which is plants and medicinal uses. Now it's time to program the list box and the other form controls, and what I'm doing is just to right click them, select format control, and identify a cell as a cell link, identify the input range, which is the name of the list of the column of the scientific names in the original database. And I'm setting up a lookup, the index lookup, that is going to use that cell link that you can see in the cell right above the list box, and then is the index formula set up to use that, bring the scientific name that corresponds to the number in that cell link. So we're currently on number 180, I believe, and it's brought out the 180th name on that list. I've set that up, and now I'm just playing around with the font style. I'm trying to identify the font style that works best for this dashboard, and identifying the size as well. So I've looked for the plant, the scientific name with the longest name basically, and I'm trying to optimize, using that to optimize the view, because I don't want to set up that database and then the names spill out or some names get cut off. So I use the longest name, which is this chrysanthemum scenario, and I use that to set the optimal, define the optimal font size for that scientific name placeholder. I've then gone ahead to use index to bring in the family name, the common names, and now I'm working on the local names and medicinal uses, and this is going to require more than a simple index lookup function because there are many names in those lists, and then we want those names to come out as rows. The index would typically just put everything referenced in one cell, but I want them to show up in multiple cells to fill up those tables that have been set up for local names and medicinal uses. So while I'm trying to figure that out, I've moved back to the navigational buttons and start to build the program for them. I'm going to need to use macros to program those buttons to work the way they should, and I'm just documenting what the logic of the macros I'm going to build will look like. I'm basically going to need 4 macros, one for each of the buttons, and I've documented the logic for each button each button. The first one is we're going to need it to change the value of the cell B2. The cell B2 is the index cell, the cell that the index formulas on this dashboard are running on. So we're going to need a macro to change that cell to 1. The next button, we're going to need a macro to remove 1, deduct 1 from whatever the value of B2 is. The third macro, we're going to need it to add 1 to the value of what it in B2, and then the fourth one, we're going to need to change the value of cell B2 to 832, which is total number of scientific plants in the database. And next thing is to name each of the buttons using the name box, and I'm giving them names for ease of reference when I move to the VBA editor. So I'm giving them names. The first one is BTN fast forward, the next one is BTN pre, BTN next, and on and on. And now I go over to the VBA editor and I start to type out the code. Like every normal VBA code, it starts with the opening line SUB and it ends with end sub. And I've named the codes to match the names of the buttons. It's an optional step, but I'm just doing this for ease of reference if I have to go back. And the codes are just a simple line of code, which is to change whatever is the value of range B2 on this sheet to either +1 of it, -1 of it, or to 1 or to 832 based on the logic that has already been defined for those 4 buttons. And finally, the last step in programming the buttons, which is to right click of each of the buttons and then click assign macro and look for the macro that matches it. And I've done that, and now I'm testing the buttons to check that they all work fine and they actually are all working correctly. Next up, I go over to the back end and then I do a bit of cleanup because I noticed there's some extra spaces in the data, particularly the data in the local names column. And I run this formula, it's master formula to clean hidden spaces in cells that combines the trim, the clean, the substitute, and the char function. I have a blog post on how this formula is set up, so I put the link to that blog post in the description for this video. I then copy the formulas that have the corrected values and paste as values over the local names column to complete the correction. Finally, I come across a formula to split the text into rows and to split the text in the local names and medicinal uses into rows. And I run the formula. This formula also is a complex formula combining several functions, the trim, the mid, the substitutes, the rep, and the rows. And it makes accommodation for that in the formula. I have typed out the formula on the screen for ease of reference. I then do a bit of enhancement of the design of the dashboard by bringing in colors, and I move the navigational buttons to the right so that all the navigational elements are on the right of the screen. So over to the back end to get more cleanup work done, and this time I'm focusing on the part used column. I noticed that there are a lot of spelling mismatches, variations in spellings, where I'm seeing fruits and then I'm seeing fruits, and a couple of other spelling mismatches. So what I determined to do is to do a massive cleanup exercise, and I'm going to do an advanced find and replace operation with the help of macros. But the first things first, I've copied the list to a new sheet and I've separated the text using text to columns, and I'm also streamlined the columns and copied and pasted so that they're all fall within one column, because the text to columns operation separated the data into 3 or 4 columns, but I've streamlined them so that they all fall within one column. And now on that column I have selected and I've done a remove duplicate operation so that I'm working with a streamlined list. And now I'm going through the names on the list one after the other, and I'm copying out every misspelling I see into a section which is going to become a new table, and against each of the misspellings I put what the corrected version should be. So for instance, I have roots over there and then I put roots, which is the corrected version. I'm doing this for all the instances of misspellings I see, including the pluralized forms, so seeds and leaves and roots. I put those as I account for those as misspellings. I put them in the old text column, and in front of them I put the singular form in the new text column. So I'm creating that new table just to the side of the old data that is going to have two columns, the old text and the new text. The old text being the misspelled version and the new text being what the correct spelling should be. And I'm doing that for the whole data in the whole pants column. And now, before I go on to the find and replace operation, I want to keep track of the changes that are going to happen to the data structure. So I pull out a complex formula that counts the number of instances of an item in an array. And this formula I have written about in one of my blog posts, and I will put the link to that blog post in the description of this video. So this formula counts the number of times an item appears, regardless of whether it's the only item in that cell or there are other items in the cell. So I have generated that count, and that count is just towards in front of the current old data. And that's the old count, and I've locked that by copying and pasting it as values. Now I move the old and new text to the back end, and I do a record macro to record one instance of the standard find and replace operation, and I edit that code at the back end by wrapping a for and next loop around it and declaring two string variables, old text and new text. And the for and next loop is going to loop through the 33 instances of misspellings based on the list I generated with old and new text has 33 records. So it's going to loop through each one of those instances. And for each instance, it would take the old text as the find and the new text as the replace, and it will run the find and replace operation. So it's done that, and I've gone over to the back end, and I can see based on the counts that things have moved around, like fruits now has more items and those misspellings are now 0. So the find and replace operation has worked successfully. I added one more item to the old and new text table and then I did the find and replace. I just did a manual find and replace for that item, and then I'm going through and I'm confirming that the wrong spellings are now recording 0, even though they were recording 1 or more in the first snapshots in the one in blue at the back end. Now over to the drawing. I got a diagram of a plant, a standard diagram that contains the key elements of a plant: the roots, the stem, the leaves, the seed, the fruits, flower. And I've taken that diagram to Microsoft Paint, and I'm just removing the label line so that I can work with it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move this diagram into PowerPoint, because what I'm going to do works better in PowerPoint. Basically what I'm trying to accomplish is to have this dynamic visual in Excel that for every plant that is selected, the part of plant that is used, for every species selected, the part of plant that is used will be highlighted when that plant is in focus. And I'm using the draw function. This is an Office 365 version, and the draw function enables you to make markings with different colors. And the beauty of those item markings or marks you create, whatever shape they fall into, you would select them. You can select them and they act like shapes, like actual Microsoft Office shapes that you can copy, paste, group, show and hide, and do those other standard things that you do with Microsoft Office shapes. So what I'm doing now is I'm using the colors that look most natural to the plant, and I'm using that to color out the roots, the shoots, the stem, the leaves, and I'm flipping back to the original repository because I want the color scheme to be aligned to what is already there, so that the right of the dashboard doesn't look like a completely different document from the rest of the document. So I've done that, and I'm taking out time to color out the parts of plants that are listed in the database: the flower, the seeds, the leaves, the roots, the stem. And I have done the first one, the leaves, and I've copied all the leaf shapes I drew out in green leaf shape, pasted them, grouped them, and brought them into the Excel document. And I'm just positioning them so that they are nicely layered in over the original diagram. And now I'm doing the same for the stem as well. I just copied that drawing that I had made of the stem with the dark green pen and pasting it. Doing that for the root as well. Copied the dark brown pen markings, pasted them. Doing that for the fruits, the yellow color. Doing that for the seeds, the purple color. And for the flower, I chose a lavender color, and I've done that as well. And I just did some slightly outsized markings, but to represent seeds, because the seeds are also a part of plant of the medicinal purpose, and I wanted them to come out more prominently in the diagram. Your typical seed will not be seen based at this scale, but I just use the pink color to make them stand out. In Excel, you have the option to select objects, and then you see a selection pane like what you see to the right now. And the selection pane, the eye symbols just in front of the pane allow you to hide and unhide the objects. Something I forgot to mention was that when I brought the groups, the shapes in, I named them using the name box. So that's why you see the name seed, flower, fruit, root, stem, and the like. And so the final thing I'm doing is to program those shapes to respond to the name selections. So the name of the code is color plants, and right after the first line of code, sub SUB color plant, I have 6 lines of code, one for each of the groups: seed, flower, fruit, leaves, roots, and stem. And each line of code is setting the visibility of each of the groups to false. So when the code starts, I want all the shapes to be invisible. And then it's going to follow up with if statements, checking if the part of plant cell, the cell that the arrow is pointing to right now, contains the word seed, then make the seed object visible. The next if statement checks for if it is flower. If it contains the word flower, then make the flower object visible. And then we do the same for the fruit, and if statement, there's an if statement for the fruit, for the leaf, the roots, the stem, and that is the code. Basically, that's essentially what the code is. And now what I'm doing is I'm programming the navigation buttons. I've stepped into the code for the navigation buttons, and I added call color plant, so that on clicking those buttons, in addition to doing either the previous, next, fast forward, or rewind function, they also call this color plant, the code that I just set up. And now this is programmed and is set up to work the way it should. Of course, some of the names are not reflected, like twig. I think I went back to correct that. And then whole plant as well. So whole plant, I went back to update the code such that every time it sees the word whole plant, it brings all the shapes out. So I'm changing the visibility to true, and I just stepped back to the code to correct the spelling, and now it works perfectly. Well, almost perfectly. And finally, I credit the author of the original database, and the repository is now complete. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe, and I'll catch you on another video. Bye.